Western civilization come from? Now, what do we mean by Western civilization? In the present world, the ability to build skyscrapers or to take out a brain tumor and cure you with chemotherapy. Where did that system come from? Because it seems to me that whether you're in Japan or whether you're in Colombia or Africa, people are being globalized and westernized. They want to take that system and replicate it or clone it within their own countries. Now, we know the origins are supposedly classical, Greek and Roman. In those terms, we have kind of a model of what Western civilization was at its origins. It was Athens and Rome, and then it was enriched by Judaism and Christianity through Jerusalem. And that meant that roughly from around 700 BC, with the rise of the Greek city-state, to the end of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, we had about 1,200 years of a globalized Mediterranean culture that provided the legacy for what we enjoy today. We can define it in a variety of ways. Literary, it's Homer's Iliad and Odyssey around 700 and 650 BC, Hesiod's works and days, the great tragedians, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, the great historians, Thucydides and Herodotus. And this influence carries on to Rome, Virgil, Catullus, Livy, Tacitus, ending perhaps with St. Augustine. Philosophically, we know the pre-Socratics, Plato and Socrates, followed by Aristotle, the Epicureans, the Stoics, Neoplatonic thinkers that combined the classical legacy with Christianity. We can do it through religion, not just early Christianity, but a sophisticated Roman Catholic Church who uses philosophical tropes to explain faith and religion. All of that we know as modern Western civilization and the ancient origins of it. We can describe it, in other words. But where did it come from? We can go on a treasure hunt, as it were, in two different ways, time and space. Let's take the latter first. Let's go through the Mediterranean and see if we can find it. We go to Egypt, and there's a colossal civilization from 3000 BC to around 700, 600 BC, and then it doesn't seem to have any influence. I'm not saying the Greeks didn't borrow from the Temple of Karnak for their early Doric architectural order. Or I'm not saying the Egyptian eye doesn't appear in classical Greek art. I'm not saying that Koroi and Korai Greek statues look like this and they have an Egyptian frozen smile. They do, but not the core of Western civilization. There's nothing in Egypt that would explain constitutional government, free market economics, private property, the ability to explain natural phenomenon by reason and logic rather than faith and superstition, the triumph of the individual, a notion of personal freedom and liberty. All of the menu of ancient and modern Western civilization has no pedigree in Egypt. By the same token, it doesn't have any in the Fertile Crescent or in Anatolia. There are law codes, Hammurabi's law code, but it's an edict. It's not something that was adjudicated as in the Athenian assembly. So we look around and we don't find places outside of Greece where the Western menu began. Well, how about by date then? Because the Greek speakers were in the Balkans, southern Balkans, from about 700 BC onward. And our hunt can sort of focus on the first monumental civilization in Greece were the Mycenaeans. Remember, these are palatial cultures that built fantastic architecture. And if we look at these ruins today at Mycenae, I mean, my gosh, there's a 70-ton lintel over the monumental Lion Gate. We can go to the Palace of Nestor in Pilos, and we know that from about 1900 BC to their fall around 1200, there was a sophisticated civilization. They even had a record system, linear B, a primitive form of writing. But the whole system collapses around 1150, 1175, 1200, whatever particular place we look at it, right around the time, a generation supposedly in the mythological tradition after the Trojan War. And what happens? There's sheer chaos. From 1150 to 800, we have the so-called Dark Ages of Greece. That monumental civilization is lost. People become nomadic. They turn away from agriculture to sheep and cattle raising. There's a barter system. The know-how of knowing how to write in Linear B, writing Greek in Linear B, is lost. And that would mean that somebody in 900 BC could walk along the ruins of Mycenae and he would see the Lion Gate, and he might fall into a Tholos tomb. He said, my gosh, These were supermen. These were people that had names like Ajax and Agamemnon. They were probably Mycenaeans. In other words, most of the Greek mythological tradition in the Dark Age was trying to make sense of monumental ruins in their very midst that they couldn't explain. It was completely abandoned. We don't know if it was because of climate, disease, natural phenomenon, the so-called sea peoples, but this monumental civilization had vanished. And in its place, we had chaos, desolation. And when civilization returned to the Balkans, yes, it did concentrate in some of the Mycenaean centers at places like Athens and in the Peloponnese, but it was very different. It was completely antithetical to the Near Eastern model that had characterized Mycenaean civilization. We had about 1,000 to 1,500 Greek city-states. They had something called an agora, a place where people could come and freely communicate and freely barter and exchange goods. There was an introduction of coinage. They took a Phoenician script and added vowels to it, and the Greek language now metamorphosized into what we know as today as classical Greek, alpha, beta, gamma, menenide, theae, etc. That language was developed with the rise of the city-state, monumental temple buildings, Temple of Zeus at Olympia, and then the classical period characterized by the refinements on the Parthenon. All of this was sort of an intellectual, material, economic revolution, and it was, again, antithetical to the palatial model that had come from the Near East and Egypt that had characterized prior civilization in Greek. And it's very akin to our own, so that when we read Antigone and about the plight of a woman who is brilliant and has been oppressed by a male-dominated society, or we read Lysistrata about the folly of war and the anti-war movement, or we read Plato about whether it's better to be hurt or to hurt somebody. These are the same issues that we're struggling with today because we are Greeks. Okay, so we've sort of solved our problem. We know that Western civilization, that is, present America through the British Empire, through European civilization and the Enlightenment, the Reformation, the Renaissance, classical Roman imperial and republican tradition that goes back to Greece. We can go back to Greece, and we can't go back any further. Further between 700 and 800 BC, there's nothing like it. And there's nothing like it anywhere. Not Japan, not the Mayans, not the later Aztecs. Now we get to the central crux of the investigation today. Well, what caused it? I mean, the climate is the same as the Mycenaeans. They still are in the Mediterranean. Why all of a sudden, between 8 and 700 BC, do we have this explosion of something called a polis, a city-state? Well, to answer these questions, we've got to remember we're in the pre-industrial, pre-scientific world. And that means we're in the agricultural world. Today in America, we're eating 1 out of 100 people produces the food for us to survive one more day. That means 99 of us can make movies, we can drive, we can conduct open heart surgery, we can build a freeway. That was not true in the ancient world. It took 9 out of 10 people to produce food. So if you're going to look at changes in culture, you better look at agriculture. And lo and behold, when we go back to Greece between 800 and 700, we see a revolution, both a social and a scientific one. Somewhere around 8 to 700, people began to master the art of grafting, and that meant that they could take very fertile cultivars of fruit trees, we're talking everything from plums to olives, and graft them onto very durable species of olives that had roots. A wild olive is all root and no fruit, and a cultivated olive is all fruit and no root. So if you can combine the two, you can start to expand the area where these species can be grown and they're much more productive. At the same time, scientific agronomy started to investigate in everything from manures to putting lime on vines to stop birds from eating the crop, to understanding what was the precise dates to plant. It wasn't just empirical, it was theoretical and abstract, scientific, so to speak. And people started to gain the knowledge and how to master the Mediterranean triad of grapes, olive trees, and barley and wheat. What was it about these 3 species that the early Greeks mastered and allowed them to create a sophisticated society like no other in their past? Think about what you have to do to consume olive oil or consume wine or consume bread. You can't eat barley, you can't eat an olive, try it, it's very bitter, and you can't just take a grape and smash it and drink a glass of red wine. They all have to be refined. In the case of barley and wheat, they have to be threshed and milled. In the case of grapes, they have to be pressed and fermented. In the case of olive oil, they have to be cured and pressed into oil. And that meant on these small farms, people traditionally would have a threshing floor, they'd have a grape press, they'd have an olive press. In other words, when they grew things that the city and the people had disconnected from agriculture did not have, they did not just sell a raw product, the proverbial method of exploitation, oppression in every society. They had control of a finished product. They had a second stage in the food process, so to speak. And now we're starting to see how this synergy began. People found that they could take land that other people had not discovered, that it would be quite adequate for grapes, olives, and grains. And I could call this internal colonization, if you will. They discovered that it was rich in the diet and complementary in the diet, and it had to be refined and they could control it. There were a couple of other key elements to the triad, and one was labor. We're talking now about a family of 5, maybe with the addition of a slave, maybe not. But notice the harvest dates. May and June for grain, June and July for grapes in the Mediterranean, September, October, November for olives. There's not a press to do everything at once, and it's a very economical method of dispersing labor throughout the agricultural year. There's one final component to this complex paradox, and that is they're diversified. If you're specialized, you can master one thing. You can be the greatest grain grower in the world, and you might know more about grain than any other farmer, but you are very vulnerable. If you have a hailstorm in June, you can lose your grain crop. You may be the greatest viticulturist in the world, but if you get a frost in March and destroys the bud, you have no crop. And what we see with diversification of these 3 crops is the farmer still had access to different crops if he were to lose one. So a rain, a flood, an insect infestation, depending on where it happened and when it happened, it did not wipe him out completely. In other words, he was autonomous, he was independent between 800 and 500, in which agricultural production becomes much more efficient, much more flexible, much more diverse, and it becomes empowering. Now, that's the key word, empowering socially, economically, politically, and militarily. Who were these people who began to discover the advantages of diversified agriculture? Well, we see them in the historical record. They can be an echo in Aristotle's Politics. They can appear on inscriptions. And politically, they want to protect their own property. They went out of the Dark Ages, they went out and fabricated the system. They have property, they want to pass it on, especially if you plant olives and vines. If you're 70 years old, why plant an olive orchard? Only for 2 reasons. You have children, and you can protect that property without a king, a Persian grandee, an Egyptian monarch, or theocrat saying that they own all the land, or a Mycenaean lord that says you have to bring it up to the palace. No, it's yours, but you have to form a constitution. So we start to see constitutions formed for one reason originally. Ancient lawgivers are worried about the protection of property. Not individual freedom at first, but property. I own this, I developed it, I want to pass it on to my children. And out of that, all of these disputes, do I have a water right to this creek? Can he trespass through my garden? All of these issues then were started to be adjudicated through a consensual process. And in the early constitutions of the city-states, and we have some of them, about 50% of the people could participate who owned property. We can call it oligarchy, we can call it moderate democracy. The ancients called it politics, politeia. And it meant that there became a consensual process to harmonize all of these individual agendas. There was not a pyramidal society, which brings us to the element of sociology. One of the problems with Mycenaean or Egyptian or Hittite or Assyrian civilization or Persian civilization is you have a pyramid, a grand elite on top and a poor working or serf class on the bottom. There is no middle property owning citizen. There's no words in those vocabularies for it. Lo and behold, in the Greek vocabulary, we see the word polites, a citizen. He's not just a farmer, but he's a citizen. That means that he has certain rights and responsibilities to the state. The state is not somebody else's, it's his. If we were to look at an aerial view of Greece at this time, we start to see checkerboards. We can see it through aerial surveillance. We can see it through archaeological field work. We can see it in a variety of literary passages. And just as each man has one spot in the countryside, so he has the same corresponding spot in the council hall, the ecclesia. I vote, and I'm equal to someone else, just like I'm an independent farmer. So politically, this agrarian system, and this is the beginning of agrarian and the romance of whom? The small, middle farmer, the working man of the soil, so to speak, all the way from Hesiod to Thomas Jefferson, the bulwark of Western civilization. Economically, remember what we're talking about. We don't have a serf class who's taking their wheat and taking their grapes and taking their olives and being whipped in as they go into a central redistribution point with a Mycenaean lord clicking on his linear B tablet what you bring and what the government owes and then giving you a little pittance back. Instead, we have people who are threshing their grain and they're coming to town with their own property, threshed grain, and they are bringing wine into town and they're bringing olive oil and they're saying you're going to buy it on a competitive basis. And out of that economic viability comes two very important concepts in Western civilization: autonomia, autonomy, and autarkia, self-sufficient. The ancient Greek citizen of the city-state prized the idea that he was going to be self-sufficient politically and self-sufficient economically. There's one last key essential to the equation: the military, because after all, in the ancient world, and perhaps the modern as well, 2 out of every 3 years people were fighting. When these small city-states had disputes with another one, usually over borders, they created a militia of what they called hoplites, men who owned soil and could bear their own arms and could afford to buy armor. They massed together in a phalanx, a dense formation of lance or spear-bearing soldiers. They had certain rules of engagement. They collided, and then the dispute over a few acres here and there between two city-states was over, and the men went back and were able to farm. In other words, they had a monopoly on the means of violence. And this is with the entire creation of civic militarism by an empowered middle class. Let me conclude. What we appreciate today as Western civilization came from somewhere. We know where it didn't come from. It didn't come from the North and South American continents. It didn't come from China. It didn't come from Egypt. It didn't even come from the Eastern Mediterranean. It came from Greece. But we know it did not come from Greece before 800 BC. We know it didn't come after 300 BC. It came in a critical period of the city-state. But that means something. It means, where do they get these ideas? The city-state's geography, the city-state's racial pool, it was no different than anywhere else. Greeks were not inherently smarter than Africans or stupider than Africans. The climate was not better in Greece than it was in Malta, for example. What happened was that for a variety of reasons, the collapse of civilizations on the Mycenaeans, the Dark Ages, people were left on their own. They began to develop a Mediterranean triad. They began to create agricultural surpluses. The population began to thrive. They had a method of conflict resolution that was quick and logical. They had a political representation. They had outlets for individual expression and economic activity. And all of this, which originated with the idea of the small family farmer, flourished and came into its own through city-states, where more and more people were able to break out from the farm. They weren't dependent on the drudgery of farming because farming itself was so efficient and was creating bounties and surpluses. I'll leave us with a final paradox, and that is, if that's what we know were the creators, those forces were the creators of Western civilization, what made Western civilization crack up at the end of the Roman Empire, or maybe even today? It would have to be something like the opposite, that you have a system where people are not productive. They don't feel they have a stake in their own economic future. They don't have political representation. They don't have control over their own military. They don't have a freedom to say and do what they want and experiment scientifically. They don't have a pride in a large middle class. In other words, you would have a small elite on top, poor people on the bottom, vast property holdings, and people not invested psychologically, materially, economically, socially, culturally, militarily in the body politic. That would be the antithesis to the creation of Western civilization.